I'm the bad engineer, but I have more fun because I get to blow it all up.
I'm only a good engineer if I can resist what he tries to do.
The engineer of that time, it wasn't all pretty, if you will. It wasn't all safe, because the engineer would come to a fort, if I may use this diagram again, because of these bastions, you wouldn't attack the front wall because of the fields of fire that would come off the bastions. Even if you got to the wall, you had another field of fire. Again, those fields of fire here, fields of fire here, so you don't attack that front wall. Okay? This front wall because of these fields of fire. What you pick on is that corner, okay? That point of the bastion. You go for that very, very straight point of the bastion. And the reason for that is because if you take those walls of the bastion and extend them out the opposite angle, and that's why the bastions were figured, was basically a dead zone, because they couldn't mount a corner, or at that corner they couldn't mount a cannon, and at best they could get one soldier in there. So you're as an attacking force, you had less of a problem. It wasn't immune, but it was less of a problem because of that one person. The engineer, of course, he would show up first with a guard, and he would reconnoiter the fort. He would do some sketches. He would decide the best way to attack it. He would pick the site of the Army's camp that was coming. Of course, then the Army and the general would show up a little bit later. He'd meet with him, give him his suggestions, and then the officer or the general would either agree with them or make changes. If he agreed, the next thing to do would be to lay out a trench line to that point of the bastion. The engineer would go out at dusk, big shiny target. Everybody knew what they were doing. Everybody knew what was happening. Now he's starting maybe 300 to 500 yards away, but he would go out at dusk, be it a handheld compass or a compass on a tripod. He would establish an angle for that trench. He would then have his chainmen measure it with an engineer's chain. The engineer's chain, 50 or 100 feet. Each link is 12 inches. And he would determine the length that he wanted that trench dug that night. He would then take fuse, as it was called in those days. It was made with pure hemp, soaked in nitrates, so if he had a bad day, he could save a piece and put it in his pipe and be happy at the end of the day. But he would lay the fuse out on that line that he established for that siege trench, and he would go back. The siege trenches always came in at an angle. It was never a straight line. Pass that, sir. Back. The reason is again, the fort could go in, set up their guns, and it happened to the engineer Williams at Fort Niagara. The first trench he laid out was right in the line of fire for the French. When they woke up the next morning, they opened fire and killed 250 soldiers. So Williams went back out the next night and picked a different angle. But when the sappers who were the diggers, came out, they'd find that fuse that was laid on the ground, they'd light it. The fuse did not burn, as we know, there wasn't a flame, but it glowed like a cigarette or a pipe. It burns an inch an hour, so they would get behind it and follow that glow, because that gave them the direction and the distance that they would dig. Simple tools, picks and shovels. They would be using hand wheelbarrows to move dirt, as well as the wooden barrels. They had things, some of the people behind them were making fascines, which were bundles of sticks, 8 inches. The bundle was 8 inches in diameter. They were 1.5 inches to 2 inches thick, 6 to 8 feet, or they could make it 10 to 12, which was a saucisson, just a longer bundle of sticks. Hatchets, of course, were norm, fascine, knives, like on the table, a copy of a French fascine knife of the period, shovels and picks. I'll start that down, sir. The first man, I'll jump to this one. There was usually a crew. I'll say this one. There was usually a crew of sappers. He had in front of him a little wheeled piece of protection. It was a slab of wood, 3 inches thick, 3 foot wide, 3 foot high on wheels with a long pole behind it. This picture shows him on his knees. He starts the first trench 3 foot wide and 18 inches deep. The second man comes behind him, digs it down 6 inches, another man another 6 inches, 6 inches till they got to 3 foot deep, 3 foot wide, 3 foot deep. These men made up a team. They were paid additional money because of the hazardness of it. If any of them got killed, the surviving people got that full amount to divide amongst themselves. As these other people were digging, they were moving up the gabions, which were baskets with no top, no bottom, but long branches that went into the ground, that they drove into the ground. And of course, they were filling them with the dirt and stones that they were digging up. They laid the fascines or saucisons on top, 2 layers. Again, just another picture depicting the types and the weave of the gabions, the equipment that they were using, and again, that way of digging in sections. They also had special little tools that moved or set the baskets or moved them for them. So they moved each way. They worked all night, essentially, to create that and to get to that end. And this is, if you will, finished product. You can see the 3 foot depth, 3 foot of gabion, 8 inches and 8 inches, 1 foot 4 on top of them. Any additional dirt went across the front for protection. So you're basically 7 foot 4 from the bottom of the trench to the top of the fascine. Average height at that time was 5 foot 8. So that was their determining factor. Here's again that depiction, and it shows you the steps of the men behind, where again, this man is on his knees and he's loading the first gabion with that, this was called a mantelet. Again, it was just a huge piece of wood, 3 foot wide, 3 foot high, 3 inches thick, to protect him from being shot. Because what happens now is once that trench is dug overnight, once that sap, that's what they called it at this time, the 3 foot by 3 foot, that was dug overnight. The next day, new sappers came out and what they would do is widen that trench to 12 foot, or sap, I'm sorry, to a trench. That's why I'm getting confused. Now it was called the trench. And they widened it to 12 feet because they wanted to put soldiers in it. A company of soldiers in the back of the trench in case the French came out in a sortie or, to try and stop the digging or to destroy the trench. They had, these guys had picks and shovels. They had the soldiers to move forward. And as the Army moved forward, I want this. As the Army moved forward and could bring their cannons into play, okay? At the closest point, they put their mortars in because, again, John had mentioned, they were lobbing them in, they were trying to destroy the buildings, they were trying to get to the powder magazine. Without powder, you can't fight.
Right.
So, that was, you read where it was constant firing all day for days. So, they brought the ammunition and were really trying to destroy the fort from the inside. Again, that's what those men are doing behind, besides lowering the trench, because it's wide enough. I mean, they were kneading it up, but they're lowering the sap, getting it down to trench level. They're digging it deeper, but at the same time, they're the ones that are moving the fascines, the saucissons, and the gabions up for this man to place. And he used this tool here to place them, because now he's sort of pushing out beyond that mantelette.
Now, they're not tied together in any way, they're just tied together.
Again, the basket was woven, but the branches that they were woven around were longer. They were like a foot longer on the bottom and on the top, okay? So when he placed that, then he needed to tamp them down with a shovel, okay? That sort of
Would they
stabilized
roll them
them.
down the trench or the sap and then somehow get them?
Well, again, keep in mind, it's just an empty basket. I mean, they could have carried them, they could have rolled.
It would have
I
been
mean,
easy
that
to
would have,
roll.
yeah, absolutely.
If you're rolling it, you're not standing up there being shot at. You're down in the ditch
Right,
rolling it.
rolling, right.
Yeah.
If the trench was only 3 feet wide, how did they roll it if there was a foot of overhang one day?
Well, it could have been rolled along the side,
I see.
on the
Okay.
inside.
The inside,
And,
right.
not facing the enemy, but on the inside, the opposite side of that wall, And again, they can roll them because they've got some protection. And then the pieces on top are holding the fascines or the saucisson
okay.
in place. And even that, they would take a stake and drive it through those bundles to keep them in place. Because one of the things that happened, again, I'll go to Williams, the engineer at Niagara. Once he corrected his error, once the trenches were being dug and the saps, he was out inspecting them during the day. Cannonball came out and hit it, and it hit one of the fascines. Well, it caused a splinter, a piece of wood, a piece of branch to come off. It drove into his eye socket, broke his eye socket. So they took him to the doctors. The doctor said, well, we can't do anything, he's probably going to die. So they put him on a bed or a cot and left him alone. A couple days later, they go back and said, oh, he's still alive, maybe we ought to do something. So they reached over, grabbed a stick, pulled it out, and put a patch on it and said, you're good. Yes, I'm being a little facetious, but that, medicine of that time, I mean, that's what they knew. It wasn't far off from that, no, took him to the operating room and brought in the eye doctor, this was later on. He learns, he still is functioning, he has a patch on his eye, so he has one eye, but he designed the drainage system for Fort Niagara, which is still in use today. That drains the parade ground of Fort Niagara. It's still there and it's still working and functioning. Once the fort had been taken by the British, they left them there to rebuild and what have you. So, that was one of the things it needed. was something to drain the fort. Again, he did redeem himself. If you will, once they got up close, again, 100 yards roughly, yeah, they're using mortars to lob in, but the other thing that they're doing is that point that I originally showed you on that bastion, that point there. What they're doing is bringing in their 24-pound cannon too, because what they want to do is breach the wall. Okay, they need to breach the wall. Once they've, again, put enough cannonballs in there and blew out, if you will, and got into the fort, it was basically the governor of the fort or the commandant of the fort said, well, they're in. You know, it's time to give up. I've done everything I can, but he should get all the credit for defending and, go out with colors flying,
Honors.
drums beating. Thank you. I was at spoils.
That's all right. Honors.
Sometimes they wouldn't. Okay, they're gonna stick us out. Relief is coming. We're gonna try and
Hope for relief comes.
and win this. So they'd stick it out because sometimes there were additional defenses inside. And again, hopefully that relief would, or they hope that the army got tired outside, or the weather changed or something. And
Weather
they're
would
gonna
help
give
the
up.
defenders?
Yeah, the defenders, absolutely. Or they ran out of food, whatever. The fort's still gonna fight. So they set up the defensive position inside. The army outside, the attacking army, goes around and picks the 2 best men from each company. Okay? Why the 2 best men? Why don't you pick the worst? Because they're the forlorn hope. They're going to die. There's no doubt about it. They're going to die. Because once they go through that breach or get in there, they don't want people to falter and come back out. They got to keep going. So you pick your best men who are going to do that. Now, if you go to Braddock's inventory of items that he brought over when he came in 1755, if you look under the engineers, they listed 2 suits of armor. It always intrigued me because I thought, are they wowing the Indians? Is this for dress? Why would they bring armor? Further reading or study, what it meant was a breastplate, a backplate, and the helm. Okay. I have read both, believe the second, but the first was they gave it to the first 2 men going through the breach. At least they would get in. They may be killed once they're in, but at least they get in and the others will
Follow?
will keep coming, But more so, it was and since it was listed in the engineer equipment, the engineers got it because they were intelligent, knowledgeable, and they were needed. The men, you could get more,
Expendable.
So the engineers would wear it, and that's what I believe, if you will.
The breast and back plates and helmets were worn by the engineers,
Yes.
not by the breachers?
Yes. No.
Wow.
No, because
Jeez.
after that first wave of the forlorn hope, the second wave was the engineers with the sappers. And all that debris they created from, and again, they were basically 100 yards away, they take on the outside of that breach and set up a defensive position. Because even if the forlorn hope is pushed back, they'll be at least on
Closer.
that
They'll
side,
be closer.
and they'll stop their forlorn hope.
Their
kind of
counterattack,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah, so they're setting up a defensive position, and the engineer is with them. So that's why he's wearing the armor, sort of a body armor at that time.
That would be part of the second wave?
He
and they
is
would
the
send-
second wave.
and they-
He is the
he's-
second
But the
wave.
engineers probably wouldn't go in until the fort was actually taken. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be snipers
they're-
in there, but
They're just on the outside.
Right.
But there is a third wave following the forlorn hope is going to go through that breach, hoping that the forlorn hope got in, a couple of men or something, and they're inside. So now you've got the third wave pushing in. But the engineers, John was saying, they're on the outside setting up a defensive position. Again, if that forlorn hope is really driven back,
Right.
if the third wave of soldiers who are to go in that breach can't even get there, then at least they get to the defensive position.
Now, inside the fort, the defenders, would they have secondary, tertiary defensive?
They-
Oh, yeah,
sure-
yeah.
Sure they would.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, that governor of commandant's just being stubborn.